And I want to ask you a basic question. I hope you're in good form today. And the reason why I'm asking that question is we're going to study a few words today, and each one has got the word form in it. I want to talk about the word reform first. And you know, when I was growing up in England, the worst thing that could happen to you as a boy is if you got sent to a reform school.
Yeah.
And they had all sorts of names for them. But basically the idea was that they were going to take a naughty boy and make him into a good boy. And from meeting some people that went to such establishments, I can say that the success rate seemed to be low.
Right.
There's a lot of talk about people who have done criminal offences being sent to prison. And the idea of sending them to prison is that they would be reformed. Now, you know what the of reform means, don't you? It's just like when you get your car tires wearing down and you have a retread, a tread again. You've lost the tread that's worn away and now you want to retread. It's the same tire, and it's the same tire all over again. When you're reforming, the idea behind the word is that we're going to take away that criminal element from you that got you into this prison, and we're going to turn you back to the good boy that you once were. There's a problem with this scenario. And that is that you probably weren't a good boy to start with. There was probably something in you, or a good girl, I might say. There's probably something in you that caused you to go wrong in the first place. And so often we find what happens is what's called recidivism. And that means that if you send somebody away to prison to serve a criminal sentence, they come out at the end of the sentence and then commit the same offence again. They do it again. Recidivism, doing the same offence again. Reform, hopefully taking you back to a form in which you don't make those mistakes, but with a very low success rate. So now we talk about reform, and we're not talking about the reform of the prisoners anymore. Now we say we must reform the prison system to make it more effective. And there's a whole lot of social issues and social justice issues that surround that subject. I just wanted to deal with that one first because it highlights the real problem. The problem is not just the prison system, though that may have its problems. And the problem is not just the fact that youth sometimes go wrong and end up in a prison. The fact is that inside each one of us, there's something within us, part of our essential nature, that means that we're exposed to doing wrong. And reform won't work because all you're doing is going back to what you were. You're not actually fixing the problem. You're starting it again. It's as though you're winding up the motor and expecting a different result when it runs through again. So that's reform. But what I want to talk to you about today is not reform, but something that's far more effective. And that's transform, transformation, being transformed. And for that we need to turn to our Bibles. And if you join me, you go to Romans chapter 12. And I'll just read verses 1 and 2 to you from the English Standard Version, but you'll read it in your own version, and it'll say much the same thing. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. This is a key point in this book of the Bible, this book, the letter of Paul to the church that was in Rome at that time. We call it chapter 12. I don't know that when he was writing this very long letter to them that he divided it into chapters, but we've done that. And I can tell you that the first 11 chapters are full of teaching that's very, very instructive. It tells us about what we're like inside, from not our own perspective, not a social justice perspective, but a divine perspective, the way that God sees us when he looks at us. And he starts out with people that think that they're really, really good and they're okay, the Jews. And then he points out that the Jews have their failings because there's something wrong inside. And then he says, well, there's Gentiles. And the Gentiles have their failings because there's something wrong inside. And we just keep on proving it again and again and again. When we look around us, we see evidence of God, but we don't want to believe that there's a God to whom we are subject to judgment. And for him to decide about whether we're good or bad. We want to make the rules ourselves, and even the rules that we make ourselves we break. And we end up in a box where God has to put everybody all under the same category and say, you're all sinners. So the first 11 chapters of this book of Romans are teaching us what God has done to fix that problem. It's a problem that we couldn't fix ourselves. None of us was good enough. But it goes through logically and sequentially what actions God has taken to fix that problem, that deep down at core in our form, we haven't got good form, we've got bad form. We are sinners, and God has done something to fix that by sending Jesus Christ, his son, as a man, a perfect man, to take away the problem that we're faced in our capacity as sinners. So that's the first 11 chapters. And because God has explained through Paul in those 11 chapters how he's fixed the problem, now you say, now I understand the problem's been fixed. What happens next? And that's why we read these verses. You still need to be transformed. Now, before we go any further, I want to tell you, those of you who've bothered to study the Bible in any depth, you'll know that in the New Testament of our Bible, we're dealing with an English translation. And when Paul was writing his letter to Rome, he didn't write it in English. In fact, it would have been very difficult at the time. But what he did write was in Greek language. And in the Greek language, there's more than one word that in our Bible is translated as transform. And one of them is a Greek word that means transform. It's the word that we get our English word metamorphosis from. We've just brought it straight into English from the Greek language. Meta, a change, morphe, form, a change in form. So metamorphosis, you know, from when a caterpillar goes from a caterpillar to being a butterfly, we say that's an amazing change. It's a transformation. It's a metamorphosis. Well, that's the Greek language. And that's what's used in Romans 12 and verse 2 when it says, be transformed. You need a total change. But there's another word. Now, in Greek, it's metaschemazo, but I'm not going to get into the Greek word for that because it's not brought into English in the same way. But in English, what we used to use to translate that word was transfigure. Transfigure. So sometimes in the Bible, you'll get the word transfigure. And sometimes it reads slightly differently, but you'll get the meaning of transfigure if I just point you to a couple of verses. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, and it occurs twice in two verses that follow each other. 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and verse 13. Such men are false apostles, deceitful workmen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. Now, in some of the older versions, you'd have seen transfigure, that the angel of light is Satan transfiguring himself. What do we learn about that? Well, I think we know what he's getting at. What is angel? Is he an angel? Well, he was an angel, but he's certainly no angel of light. He's an angel of darkness. And what he looks like on the outside is just an appearance that he's giving for something that's rotten at the core. And then he says, now, if that's what Satan is like, people who go down his way are going to do the same thing. And they're going to look a whole lot better than they really are. So he says they're false apostles, and they're disguising themselves or transfiguring themselves as apostles of Christ. They're not really apostles of Christ at core, but they're just making themselves appear that way. So that's transfiguring and transfiguration. Now, I apologize for the long words that some of you won't like, but you do come across this word in the Bible, and you come across it in Matthew chapter 17 and verse 2, and the same place in Mark's gospel, the same in his record, Mark chapter 9 verse 2, and it says there something about a mountain where Jesus was transfigured. And I want to tell you, it's a mistake. The real word there is not the Greek word transfigure, it's the Greek word for transform. So when we talk about, those of you who know your Bibles and know about the Mount of Transfiguration, from today I want you to, every time you hear it, say, no, the Mount of Transformation. because that's what was happening on the mountain. Do you remember that Jesus had taken his 3 disciples with him, taken them privately up the mountain, and then when they got there, all of a sudden he changed completely. And what they saw was not the normal exterior that they saw when they looked at Jesus. They saw the glory that was shining out from who he really is. So transformation deals with what you are inside and shows that on the outside. In the butterfly the starting point is a real caterpillar, and it comes out in the butterfly. It isn't actually changing to another species or something, and it's not just appearing as something different. It's showing what it really was. It was a caterpillar, and now it's a butterfly. Jesus was really always the Son of God. People hadn't seen it so apparently, and so he's transformed in front of them, and he takes the form on the outside that he's already on the inside. Oh, now we can go back to Romans chapter 12 and verse 2 and see what it says there about being transformed. He says, I'm making a plea to you based on what you've already learned about what God has done for you. Don't stand still. I want you to be transformed by the renewing of your mind. He wants you to be on the outside what you now are on the inside. Now, how can we explain that? Do you remember when Jesus met with that leader of the Jews, Nicodemus, and he told him that if you're to see things from a divine perspective, the way that God sees them, you're going to have to be born again. You're going to have to be regenerated. You're going to have to have a new birth experience. When God causes you to be born again, he totally changes you from the inside out. You become a new person. And you say, well, I don't feel very different from what I was before. Well, you should. And what's now required, when God has done his bit and changed you inside, you've now got to work on it, so that's the way you appear to other people on the outside. You're not supposed to look and act and talk and speak and think the way you did before. God has made you new on the inside, and what's new now needs to be evidenced in the way that you live. One of the disciples that were on that mountaintop was John. And John was a writer. He wrote the gospel, didn't he? He also wrote 3 letters to Christians in his day. And in one of those letters, he says, what is born of God cannot sin. What is born of God cannot sin. The new birth that God has caused to happen in each one of us who are Christians, he's not given us something that can make a mistake and mess up again. No. What he's put inside, it cannot sin. So what's happening when we do sin is that's when we're guilty of transfiguring instead of transforming. And we're trying to be goody two-shoes and appear before people to get their praise, but in actual fact, we're not really disclosing the reality of what God has done on the inside. We need to get back to what God has done and let that emerge in its beauty like the butterfly from the caterpillar. So we've been given every benefit from God, and we've got to turn that into reality and practice. And if we don't, the old person that we are will still be all that other people see. We'll still be living as though God had never made that change inside. And other people will see the deficiencies. And they might even say to us some days when we do something, call yourself a Christian. You've heard about that? Oh, yeah. And we know what it means, don't we? When you see people act hypocritically, you say, call yourself a Christian? You're not supposed to be like that. When you see people that are unforgiving, call yourself a Christian? You're not supposed to be like that. To be a Christian means to be Christ-like, doesn't it? Now, there was Jesus Christ on the Mount of not transfiguration, but transformation, revealing who he was inside. And he now, in getting Paul to write to the church in Rome and from them to us, he's telling us we need to go through this experience of transformation too. By the renewing of our mind, he says. He deals with the negative first, and he brings in another form word, conform. He says, don't be conformed to the world. And this is the big disaster territory for us. There's so much going on around us that can excite us. There's so much that can captivate us because it's speaking to that old person that's still there within, instead of to the new person that God has made us. And we can be so captivated with all the desires that we used to have that we end up being hardly of any value to God in our life of service as Christians. He wants us not to be conformed anymore, not to look like, not to take the shape of the world that we're supposed to have left behind, but to take the shape of something else. Now, while we're on conformed, let me just take you back a little bit. Let's go back a long way. Let's go back to the Garden of Eden. Let's go back to God forming man out of the dust of the ground. Man, Adam and Eve together. It says that he made them in the image of God. In the image of God. Can you imagine what he would look at when he saw them, and how excellent they were when they first came from God's hand, without any sin or any weakness or any deficiency? And then by the time you get to chapter 3 of Genesis, what do you read about there? Well, the evil one, the angel of darkness now, has come in and tempted Eve and got her to take the fruit that was forbidden and share it with her husband, and he, in absolute guiltiness, has taken it, knowing what he was doing was wrong, and now God is coming back to the garden and he calls out, Adam, where are you? He doesn't say that because he doesn't know where Adam is. He wants Adam to ask the question of himself, where am I? I'm hiding in the bushes. Why are you hiding in the bushes, Adam? I'm naked. I'll be ashamed. Who told you you were naked? And then the whole story comes out and the pointing fingers happens. You remember it? What does God do about it? It says that they had made coats out of fig leaves, sewed them together. I don't know if Adam sewed them or Eve sewed them or they both sewed them. I know who it would be in our house. And I guess if you think about what it would look like, it would almost be like a smock or something that they put on. And what does God give them? God gives them something that's made of skin. He said he makes a new garment for them that's made of skin. One thing I'm pretty sure of about that is that when they were put on, Adam and Eve, the contour of the garment would follow the shape of Adam and the shape of Eve. Not like the fig leaves to get that just sort of hung over them. All of a sudden God's going to clothe them, and he's going to clothe them in something that conforms to what they are underneath. In the vast purpose of God, even in that garden scene, we've got a projection of what Jesus was going to do for you and me, when he was going to reclothe us, when we have sinned and fallen short of God's glory, and we're no longer showing it. And then God comes in, and then because we believe that Jesus died, was punished for us instead of us, and we accept what he's done for us and we're free, then God reclothes us in his righteousness, garments of righteousness instead of garments of sin. Not just a covering of leaves, but a garment that fits, and that when God looks at it, he's looking at you through the righteousness that he covers you with, and it's a righteousness that conforms to the new birth that he's caused you to experience inside. Oh, you can be transformed if you don't conform anymore to your old ways, but if you allow God to allow you to renew your mind. If you want to get a little bit more into that, then you'll have to go to verses like Titus chapter 1 and verse 15. Let's just quickly read that together. Titus chapter 1 and verse 15. And it says, to the pure all things are pure, but to the defiled and unbelieving nothing is pure, but both their minds and their consciences are defiled. So here's the positive and the negative set side by side. And you'll have to just make your own personal assessment now as to whether you're in good form as we begin to wrap up. What are you conforming to? The world or the Word? Are you allowing God to so influence your life that when you see things that would previously been a temptation to you, you now see them for what God sees them as? A disturbance in your life, something that's going to make you less rather than more in your service for Him. So don't go after the old things. That's conforming to the world. The opportunity that He gives you is to conform your mind and your conscience to the Word of God. We didn't read it, but earlier on in the book of Romans in chapter 6, it says that you previously were servants of sin, but you've been delivered from that into a pattern of teaching that you're now obedient to. A pattern there is a word for a mould. I don't know whether you, when you were a child, you used to make things in a mould. I know I've got some really lovely chess pieces upstairs that were made in a mould, I think. And you see that what you pour in, the resin or the wax or the putty or whatever it is that you're doing with children, and then you take the mould off, and the new piece looks exactly the same as the mould if you've done it right. You used to be servants of sin, but now you've poured yourself into a different mould, a pattern of teaching. What's that teaching about? What's the new mould that we're supposed to be pouring ourselves into? What is this new mould that reflects the fact that we have, in the words of Paul to Titus, their minds and their consciences are defiled, but for us, to the pure, all things are pure. How is it that we're now able in this new mould to look and see things in purity instead of in disobedience, seeing only them as opportunities to do evil? Oh, it's a wonderful change that God has got already and prepared for us. And He says in Romans 12 and verse 2 that we do it by the renewal of our minds, renewing our minds. Let me just give you a verse without turning to it and reading it. 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 23, where it says that you've got to sanctify yourselves, body, soul and spirit, so that when Jesus comes back from heaven to this earth to collect you for Himself for all eternity, He'll find you that you're sanctified, that you're pure in body and soul and spirit by the renewing of your mind, so that you'll evaluate things differently and you'll see purely everything as pure and not go after the things that are so negative in all of their defilement that they bring upon your mind and your life. So that's the message for today. Don't be conformed to the world. Be conformed to what you are, what God has made you. Show up by your transforming that's going on continually. He's done the starting point and given you a new birth. Now you must be transformed, and you'll do it by the renewing of your mind. And as you do it, you will show that the will of God for you is good and acceptable and perfect. And you won't want to just be reformed, you'll want to be transformed. And you won't want to be transfiguring yourself to appear what you're not really inside. You want to be transformed to show from on the outside what God has made you on the inside. And you want to pour yourself into the mold of teaching. And if you want an example, what does that mold look like? Read in the Bible everything you can find about what Jesus did, how He lived and how He worked, and pour yourself into that mold of His example. And that's the answer to these questions today that all have to do with, are you on good form? Thank you for listening.
What can I give? blessed